Great. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. James Broomall, an associate professor of history at Shepherd University, as well as the director of the George Southern War Center for the study of the Civil War. And I'm very excited about tonight's program, not only because of the topic, but because in this instance, I happen to know the participants rather well, and I'm extremely happy to sort of spotlight and highlight what they do as scholars and what they do actually incredibly well as scholars. And so on my screen, at least to the side, is Dr. Angela Elder. Angela, we're going to go by first name basis here because we all know each other.
That works, yep.
Yeah. Angela received her PhD from the University of Georgia. She is an assistant professor of history at Converse College. And before coming to Converse, she had the very prestigious postdoc at Virginia Tech, worked with Paul Quigley there. Her dissertation was awarded in 2017, the C. Van Woodward Prize. It's an absolutely exquisite work and a very important recognition. And she has also co-edited a collection, Practical Strangers, which is the courtship correspondence between Nathaniel Dawson and Elodie Todd.
Elodie, yep.
And so Angela is obviously extraordinarily busy, and she's currently transforming her dissertation into a book, which we all eagerly await, and will very likely be published by the University of North Carolina Press. Below me is Allison Fredette. Allison was awarded her PhD by the University of Florida, and she received both her BA and her MA from West Virginia University. Go Mountaineers, go Gators. Allison and I actually attended grad school together and have stayed in touch over the years. And so it's been sort of exciting to see her career. She is currently an assistant professor of history at Appalachian State University. She has published numerous articles, including pieces in West Virginia History and the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. She contributed an essay in the collection that our mentor, William A. Link, edited and I edited, Rethinking American Emancipation. And her book, which you can sort of bring up for us, Allison, has been recently published 2020. So a fresh published, Marriage on the Border, Love, Mutuality, and Divorce in the Upper South During the Civil War. And so with that, I welcome everyone, and I'll be monitoring the comments section this evening. We already have a good number of people viewing and coming in live, so thank you very much. We deeply appreciate, as always, your participation in our discussion this evening. As you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments section, and I will try to respond as able. And in some instances, we'll probably kind of go back and see what we can fill in after the program is over. Okay, so that's the game plan. So what we want to do this evening is talk about marriage and talk about mourning rituals, primarily among white Southern women and men. We're going to look at the Upper South, we're going to look at the Border South and the border states rather, and we'll hopefully kind of provide a holistic vision of this region. And to sort of start off the discussion, I thought it might be useful to provide maybe some cultural context as to what we think we know as a people about white Southern women, the notion of white Southern womanhood, and sort of what cultural cues have shaped our collective image of white Southern women, both accurately and inaccurately. And so maybe with that, can you all give us sort of a sketch as to how most people, perhaps in popular culture, perceive white Southern women?
Yeah, so whenever I'm teaching about this in class, I always bring up a picture of Scarlett OHara, right? And luckily, most of my students still know who she is, although I dread the day when they're like, who is this? So I bring her up and, you know, who is this? Oh, Scarlett OHara. And usually it's in the context of widowhood. And I say, well, what do you think? Is she a well-behaved widow or a poorly behaved widow? And they have no idea. And so I have a lot of fun using her to kind of spiral outwards and say, what are white women supposed to be? What are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to marry? How are they supposed to mourn? How does the Civil War shape this? And then start bringing in some of the stories from my research.
Allison, do you have?
Yeah, I was hoping Angela wouldn't get to the question first because I was going to say Scarlett OHara as well.
Great minds, great
But
minds.
yeah, I think for me, what I would say, which is spinning off of Scarlett OHara, is I think most people, when they think of white Southern women in the 19th century, they think of women on plantations. They think of wealthy slaveholding women. And so I think, especially as someone who grew up in Appalachia, that was really interesting to kind of explore a different group of white Southern women, because I do think that really has dominated the media. And I think even if we still think about some of my students at App State, will know about all these debutante society, these coming outs that still go on and dressing as the Southern Belles. And so I think that either through Scarlett OHara or through the way, wedding venues and these other things have carried on these legacies, that idea is still very much in the popular mind.
It's not a terribly complex portrait, is it,
No.
of Southern women? And so maybe that might be useful then to discuss broadly what are some of the ideas that shape gender norms in the antebellum era, so around the eve of the Civil War. What's the social structure of the typical white Southern household? How can you kind of contextualize truth versus sort of fiction for our audience here? So just give us some of those broader cues and overviews.
So I guess I would say when I talk about this with my students, there's a number of ways to kind of approach this. I think you can be overly simplistic with this, but I'm very regional in how I think. Obviously in my book, I'm thinking about borders. So I'm constantly thinking about North and South and East and West. And so I am really interested in the ways in which region influences gender roles. So when I think about the South, I think about the ways in which a lack of large scale industrialization really influences a different sort of household structure and community structure. And so we can kind of think back to earlier women's historians talking about private and public spheres, how that's much more fluid in the South. You're not seeing that same kind of differentiation in the South that you're seeing in the North. And I also talk with my students a lot about the ways in which white Southern women, do they think of themselves, when they think of themselves, it's almost like when we talk today about ideas of intersectionality. But how are they thinking about themselves? Are they thinking about themselves as women? Or are they thinking about themselves as white? And so I also like playing around with those ideas of what parts of their identity are they more strongly attached to, because I think in a lot of ways we see white Southern women are much more attached to their whiteness than they are sometimes to their identity as women. So those are some of the ideas that I really think about when I think about conceptualizing gender roles in the South during this period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's so important. That's a great foundation, especially in class, if you can get students to start grappling with some of those concepts, and then you can start layering the more practical, the daily life, the roles, which they think perhaps they're more familiar with, right? The march to the altar and how important marriage is, at least in the ideal for so many white women, and then talking a lot about motherhood and what it is that many white women and white families hope for out of that. And then again, start layering what is the reality like compared to these ideals? What does it really look like, not only with race, but again, class, and looking at how that in turn affects their daily life and what their schedule is going to be.
Yeah, good, thank you. And correct me if I'm wrong or unfair here, but I think what is also useful, and there's already been some discussion in the comments here, and I'm going to bring one of those questions up for us, but there are some pretty distinct differences between notions of womanhood, both North and South. And whereas in the North, there is a slow movement, a political awakening for many white Northern women, you don't necessarily see that same political awakening in an overt way, in a public way in the South, often because many of the women's rights movements are associated also with abolition. And we're going to talk about the politicalization of women, certainly. and Elizabeth Varyn, of course, spoke to this very eloquently years ago. But there are some very distinct notions of womanhood that are based upon the social order, based upon the abolitionist movement, while small in the North, but still nonetheless important. And so is that fair as a beginning point here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely fair. And it's so much more complicated, I think, than just North and South. Because again, once you bring in, the border region and all of that, and especially when you start looking out to the West, and I think of all the fantastic work that's getting done out there and work I'm excited about, because for me personally, I feel like that history and historiography is something that we've overlooked as women's historians, as Civil War historians for so long. So I'm interested to see what kind of layers that adds as well. I would say though, certainly not to the extent that many Northern women are involved with things like abolition, but if you think about things like temperance and religion, and some of those movements are gaining traction for sure in the South, particularly in more urban regions, which again makes it so much more complicated than when you think of your Southern plantation belle as a representation of all of these experiences that happened.
Good, and I think there's some pretty important scholarship to suggest too that women's control over the household, over production, is in itself very politicized. Is that fair? Okay. So the question that's already arisen, and I think we were going to sort of get there, but let's just go for it. How does the wartime era begin to change these gender norms? And we won't get into yet the deaths of spouses and divorces. We're going to wait for that macabre subject matter. But for now, how does the wartime era begin to transform these roles? So we'll use that as a starting point.
So I think the first and foremost, the way it challenges gender roles is in the way that it challenges gender roles in other wars too. We see the same thing in the Revolutionary War. We talk a lot about in women's history classes, is the idea of men's absence and how that impacts the expectations for what women are supposed to do on the home front, in literally in the home. So, I mean, there's a variety of ways, but that's the way I usually kind of start with thinking about it, is what happens when you're removing men from the home to this. There's been this expectation that women are in a subordinate position. They're not decision makers. They're not the ones who do most of the quote unquote work. Even if they're working, it's not being called work, right? And now that is changing. I see that myself when I look at letters from husbands to wives. You can see this tension. Sometimes it's going really well and they're kind of clicking. And then sometimes I've seen men who are kind of like, I don't know, just make a decision. And these women are uncomfortable. And then as the war goes on, you see some of them growing more and more comfortable in this role, which women's historians have usually labeled the kind of deputy husband role. And so that gives them a sense of some of them not, of independence from their husbands and more power. And that then can really challenge things when men come back into the home at the end of the war, which is one of the things I look at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of my favorite things. If you're lucky enough to have a collection where you get them, in 1861 all the way through. And it's not in every case, of course. Some women go in and they know exactly what they want to do and where they want to plant things and aren't interested in advice. But many of them do. They write to their husbands and they say, what should I do? How should I handle this? How should I handle that? And some husbands give a lot of that advice. But I think Allison's exactly right. Some of them say, you know best now. I'm not there. You just have to make the decision. And watching that confidence grow and the tone shift, that's a major shift that's happening in a lot of households as women are forced in some cases to take on those roles. Some of them are choosing to take on those roles. And I think a lot of it has to do too with the structure of the household and whether or not, is there a father around? Is there an uncle around? Is there a brother around, to be sure too, in kind of playing out those dynamics. The other thing that I have been really fascinated by is to the extent that men rely on women for emotional support during the war, right? So the ways in which they are asking for support, for letters. I mean, how many letters have we all read if you're studying this sort of thing that say, write me more often, tell me the news, why aren't you writing me constantly? And how that emotional support is, essential to what they're doing at war as well.
Yeah, that's one thing I really explored in my book, because one of the things I was thinking about is how does the war change what what marriages look like. And one of the things I was thinking about is the ways in which in some of these border South areas, like parts of Kentucky and what becomes West Virginia, there was already in many of these relationships a sense of mutuality, a sense of leaning on each other and having kind of obligations and responsibilities to one another. And that's being exacerbated now by the war. And then looking at Virginia, where there was less of this in this kind of plantation part of Virginia, and I see that uptick even in Virginia, which has been they're not as reliant on each other for this emotional support. But then that, for me, falls apart a little bit more after the war. But during the war, it is definitely there. I've definitely read those letters. And you just, they're constantly writing about home and how I miss you and you're the most important thing to me. Say what you will about white Southern men and the Confederacy. It's like often it's their wives and then the Confederacy, because that is really a lot of what they're focusing on in their letters.
I think there's this interesting paradox there, right? Like on the one hand, there's a new intimacy that's acquired by distance. So the married couples are forced to be, they reveal so much more of themselves, I think, because they realize the emergency of the situation. There's this distinct possibility that they may never meet again. And of course, many marriages, as we know, as Angela's going to talk about, do end because of the wartime era, because of the death of a loved one. But at the same time, though, they're immersed in such different worlds that they're profoundly disconnected. And so there is this tension, as you highlight, Allison, and Angela, that many men are asking to maintain control over the household, yet the women are the ones that ultimately know what's going on. And the women themselves are experiencing their own trials and tribulations, and men are saying, write more, without understanding necessarily that the women themselves are occupied with children, if they're slaveholders, with the enslaved population. There's just, I think, this tremendous complexity that is reshaping these marriages in a whole host of ways. So let me turn over again. Thank you all for tuning in. We have a lot of longtime friends of the center and a lot of questions popping up quite rapidly here. And so I'm going to try to address them as I can. And again, I apologize if I can't get to everyone's questions. But I think Kevin has an interesting point here. Both of you are probably versed into Volvia Glimpse work, as well as Stephanie Jones Rogers' relatively new book. And I guess what Kevin's asking here is how does Jones Rogers and Glimpse work sort of inform how we are now thinking about Southern slaveholding women? So do you all want to offer any sort of insights as to where we're going in the scholarship and how we're rethinking white Southern women?
I mean, I guess I would say that they both are taking away that mythical sheen that we've put on, white Southern women. Obviously, when I talk about in my kind of gen ed classes, so when I'm talking less about the scholarship, but I want to get those ideas in, I often I put up a picture of Scarlett OHara, who, let's face it, she has her own feistiness, but it's usually labeled as feistiness and not brutality in the way that the women in Glimpse and Jones Rogers are. And then I show the Sarah Paulson character from 12 Years a Slave. And there are so many scenes in that movie where you see her being, I guess to use a word we use now, more complicit in this slaveholding regime. And she is actively perpetuating and perpetrating violence on the enslaved people in her home. And so I think that it really challenges us to see women as part of the power structure too. I try to get my students to think a lot about the ways in which white Southern women, yes, they are below white Southern men in the power structure, but they are above plenty of people, and they can be both I hate to use oppressed with like white Southern women because I don't even feel like really that works with them, but they are oppressors too. And so that's kind of what my students, I regularly assign in my women's history an article from Stephanie Jones Rogers that talks about how white Southern women are brought up in this culture and taught to be mistresses, and it always profoundly shakes my students to think about, it's like they think these ideas were just there. And so when you really show them the way they were taught and raised and this culture was created, I think that's really powerful too.
Yeah, that's,
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and just powerful too, then when we start turning to Reconstruction, right? And so things aren't just put back together by, you know, sweet, mourning, heartbroken female, you know, that they can start to understand the political agenda that much more and see those threads, not just into the Civil War, but into the antebellum era, and how then that's going to affect what's happening, even as the Confederacy, is the Confederate male, is broken and lost all of this political power, how there's still a lot of power and that white women are playing a role in that as well. So
yeah, I think that's a perfect segue into like thinking about the monuments and how they build the monuments, because they're not political, but if we really deconstruct the way they're part of the power structure, we can show the way that's obviously not the case.
Good. Yeah, thank you. We're flying. We got a lot of material over here. I'm starting to panic. So I think for the viewers, I would strongly encourage you to read the work of both Angela and Allison. Again, Angela's book is forthcoming. She does have a series of articles that are already out. Allison's book, as she showed us, is out. And one of the reasons why they're here today is because I think they both have really interesting methodologies. And so I'm going to start with Angela, then I'm going to go down to Allison, and then we're going to find a point of connectivity. And so Angela was a student of Steve Barry, a scholar that I just have immense respect for, and literally reshaped my entire understanding of how to do history. And we both have a shared interest in what's called emotions history. And so can you explain to our audience what exactly is emotions history and how you've applied this lens in your reading of source materials?
Right. So I don't think anyone would really, you know, if you look at your own life, you see how your emotions affect your thought process. They affect the way that we live, the way that we see the world, our actions, our emotions. It's all intertwined, right? As far as the field of history goes, for so long, the field of emotions was left to psychologists, people who are studying the science behind this. And for history, there's a great deal of skepticism, which I think is valid, that just because someone writes something in a diary, well, how do you know? How do you know that that's what they actually felt? How do you know if this is performative or not? And so what I've been really interested in is, yes, you know, it is possible, obviously, that someone could just be going through the motions. But if you start layering on voice after voice after voice after voice, and you get into 10, 20, 30, hundreds of voices, then you start to see how all of these emotions can overlap and how they can be channeled. And my research is in the Confederacy, as far as my source base goes. So I started looking at the ways in which the Confederacy was interested in women and their emotions, and then more importantly, how they are channeling these emotions. So for a Confederate widow, for example, if she loses her husband but continues to support the Confederacy, uses her emotional capital to support the Confederacy, that's a really powerful endorsement to say, I lost my husband, but this cause is worth it. For a Confederate widow who says, no, enough is enough, maybe turns to anger, maybe turns to bitterness, says, send home my brother, send home my father, send home my male cousins, that's a really powerful indictment against the Confederacy. And so more and more, the Confederacy, the politicians, the newspapers, they're watching Confederate widows, women who are, you know, young, in many cases, not entirely, but you do have 17, 18, 19-year-old women who now have all of this attention on how are you mourning? How are you meeting the ideals? Are you behaving in a way that's going to support the Confederacy or not? And so I say all of that as an example to show this is what an emotions historian can do. They can look at how these big emotions that people are living through in this moment are affecting more than just daily life, how they're affecting politics, how they're affecting religion. And that's just something that I've been fascinated with, that Steve Barry and I would have these conversations about and start to unravel. So.
And again, for those of you tuning in, when I refer to Angela Elder, our guest, whose book again is going to be forthcoming, do you have something that you've written that you could offer our audiences that is a distillation of where you do this so well?
Sure. So I wrote an essay in Kentucky Women that focuses particularly on Emily Todd, who's a younger sister of Mary Todd Lincoln. And so I talk about Mary as a widow within, the United States, within the Union. And then I talk a lot about her younger sister, Emily, who was married to a Confederate officer who plays the ideal part of the Confederate widow, and how she uses that role, how she uses her emotions. I mean, she very much misses her husband, seemed to have loved her husband, but at the same time, she uses all of this to get political positions, to become a postmistress, to give speeches all across the former Confederate states, to go to veterans associations. At one point, they put her face on the buttons of their meetings. So she uses all of this to tap into this political project. So that's a good 15-page segue that can get you started.
Wonderful. And again, thank you all for commenting. There's a lot of comments, and so I'm trying to sort of keep up with everything. It's going to be very difficult to sort of parse everything out, but our friend Mike from Maine actually has a question that immediately segues to what I was going to ask Allison anyway. So Allison Fredette has likewise employed a pretty interesting methodology, which is she examines the border states, this upper South region that is very distinct from the Gulf Coast, very distinct from the Deep South. And for those of you tuning in, I mean, I think it's very important to understand the South is a very complex region for a whole host of different reasons. And so what I think is so revealing about your work, Allison, is that your comparison between Kentucky and Virginia is quite revealing as to how these two different states and their experiences in turn impact both marriage and divorce. And so can you give us sort of the overview as to why you worked in that region, and then how in turn what your findings show us about marriage and divorce in those two areas?
Yeah, so I mean, truthfully, I studied that region because that's the region I'm from. So I started when I was in my master's program, and I started by looking at West Virginia, which I think is criminally understudied.
Yeah.
It's a pretty fascinating place, and especially when it comes to the Civil War, it's usually just focused on in terms of its kind of political creation, maybe a little bit about the Philippine races or something like that. But I was really interested when I was growing up living in West Virginia, but as someone who had moved around a lot, at the fact that other than being Appalachian, West Virginians didn't have necessarily a concrete regional identity. I tell this story a lot about a friend of mine who went to medical school in Chicago. And when he got there, they were in a huge auditorium. So he's born and raised in West Virginia. They're in a huge auditorium, and the speaker is saying, if you're from New England, stand up. If you're from the West Coast, stand up. And if you're from the South, stand up. And my friend kind of starts to stand up, and then he sits back down. And then they're like, if you're from the Mid-Atlantic, and he kind of starts to sit up, and then he sits back down. And then finally, in this big auditorium, they call on him, and they're like, where are you from? And he's like, I'm from West Virginia. And he knew they weren't going to say Appalachian. So he was like, I don't know where to put myself. And so I really went into this question of what is this idea that these places can't situate themselves? And so then I went back into the 19th century and tried to really read through people's letters and look at how they talked about themselves. And especially West Virginians in 1861, as they are thinking about creating a new state, they're literally breaking their identity away from Virginia. And as they're doing that, they're trying to figure out, as we're crafting laws, as we are creating a government, who do we feel like? Who do we not feel like? And so that was really where it started. And then I went downriver and extended to Kentucky. And so I really wanted to think about these places as borders. And I think when I started out, I was thinking, all right, North-South, we're during the Civil War. That's a straightforward border. But as I really got into it and people pushed me, I started to think about this as a much more complex thing. And this border being much richer than the Union and the Confederacy. So when I talk about the border, and I should say in border scholarship, there's a lot of different terminologies and ways in which people define it and regions they study. I tend to use border South, and I tend to focus on Kentucky and West Virginia and kind of Appalachian Virginia. But I was really interested in the ways in which the border is also something about westward movement. We forget sometimes that this area was once the West. And even at this point, it's kind of a jumping off point to the frontier. I also wanted to think about like political boundaries, religious boundaries, economic boundaries. I thought a lot about movement. Like these are places where people are migrating in and out of, and how do all of those things contribute to a society where their kind of cultural, their ideologies are blending and fighting, and how does that then shape the household? That's a long rambling answer, but that was it was a long rambling process to write the book.
Sure. And you do find these very distinct differences though, right? In rates of divorce petitions, for instance, between Kentucky and Virginia.
Yeah, and I think the first place I really saw that when I was doing my research was when I looked actually after the Civil War, since that is one thing that we're going to focus on, is the population of Kentucky and Virginia, at least the white population, was fairly similar, but the rates of divorce in Kentucky after the Civil War and Virginia, it's like 7 times more in Kentucky. And so I was like, what is going on with that? And so then I really took it back into the antebellum era, and I looked at kind of prescriptive literature. So I literally would look at the advice manuals that people were giving to people as they were getting married. I would look at letters from people as they were courting and kind of talking about, here's what I will do for you, here's what I will give you, here's how I'll be as a wife or a husband. And diaries of when people were actually married. And then the big source I use are the divorce cases, which I think are really good sources to kind of show what people either expect for themselves out of a marriage and what they feel like failed, or what they think society should expect out of a marriage. So what they basically think is a justifiable reason to get divorced or not. And I really discovered that that in Kentucky and West Virginia, they were using this higher levels of language of mutuality, talking about our responsibilities to one another. We're in this together. We both have responsibilities in the household. And then when I looked at divorce, I saw much more emphasis on contractualism, that in Kentucky and West Virginia, there was this idea of, we got married and this other person didn't uphold kind of their end of the bargain. They have had an affair, or they have left me, or even in Kentucky, they use irreconcilable differences. They don't use that word, but they are using those ideas. They're saying like, we just don't want to be together anymore, and that should be good enough. That is not happening in Virginia. Virginia is fighting all the divorce. I mean, like, people are barely filing at all. When I went to look in heavily slaveholding counties, I had to try 4 different counties before I could find a divorce in the 10 years before the Civil War to even study. So they are really fighting those divorces, and they continue to fight them very explicitly after the Civil War too, in a way that they're not in the border states.
And I do want to highlight that. I mean, if we look to the Deep South, I think that'd be a very similar pattern as to Virginia, that divorce is extraordinarily rare actually during the Civil War era among most Southern states. And so Kentucky is in some ways an outlier, but it's also a very useful counterpoint. And if I'm understanding your argument, I mean, that has to do with what the ideals of marriage were going into it. Is that
Mm-hmm.
correct? And so you use a specific phrase to describe marriages in the mid-19th century, this companionate ideal.
Yeah. Can
you explain that to our viewers?
So the companionate ideal is something that historians have been talking about for a long time. It's really kind of an Atlantic world idea at this point. It's something that's happening in Victorian England. It's happening in the United States as well. And this is just the idea of that you are marrying a person based on love. I mean, to boil it down to its most simplistic thing. And so it's basically saying you're looking for a companion in your relationship. You're looking for someone that you love or that you could communicate with, you're emotionally compatible. That this is a shift, depending on the historian you look at, that's happening anywhere from the kind of late 18th century into the mid 19th century, depending on which historian you look at or where you look at. that, but obviously people married for love before this, but that the driving factor in a lot of marriages before this was economic, especially if you're looking in upper or what we might call middle class. And now that is starting to shift.
And, I used to assign, I quit assigning it, but Jan Lewis's book, The Pursuit of Happiness, which I adore. My students didn't like it as much, but that's another story for another day. And one of the things that Lewis really stresses in that book, which I think is a really early, interesting attempt at emotions history, is that these early marriages in the 18th century, she often describes as sort of business transactions. And she's looking at a very specific echelon, the upper classes, and they do marry to sort of contain wealth among a very select group of Virginia families, because she's looking only at Virginia. And then as Allison has noted, and then sort of changes over time, these ideas start to shift and people become much more willing to reveal portions of themselves. Ideals like love, companionship begin to emerge in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And that does prove transformative, but not equal across the board. I mean, Susanna Lebskog, has a pretty critical take on companionate marriage in the Free Women of Petersburg, which I always found really interesting. But anyway.
Oh yeah, she has the line. I use her line in my book. That
Okay.
Companionate marriages are only as companionate as men want them to be. I think it's something like that.
Yeah.
Which I think is a great line, and is true in many cases. You need to keep the kind of legal realities in check.
Right. So let me shift to Angela, and thank you, Allison. That's great. So Angela, you look at one of the most difficult situations that a woman could be in, and that, of course, is the loss of a spouse, in this case, during the wartime era. And so can you talk a bit about this process that it's 200,000 is the figure I believe you cite, 200,000 white Southern women go through over the course of the Civil War, a catastrophic scale of loss. And so talk about the mourning process, mourning rituals, and how they begin to emerge, kind of evolve, I guess, during the Civil War era.
Yeah, absolutely. I think evolve is the right word, because there certainly was a structure in place for this across the nation, of how a widow is supposed to mourn. And those etiquette books that Allison referenced, I mean, it's written in there right alongside a lot of the marriage guidelines as well. So in the ideal, a widow will mourn for a minimum of 2.5 years. She will be easily identified as a widow based on what she wears. She wears black. She progresses into lavenders and grays over the course of that 2.5-year mourning period. She should turn to her faith as a source of comfort. If she has any children, she should turn to her children. Those are the biological, those are the connection to her husband, right? So much so that I think it's fascinating that during the Civil War era, when a father dies, they refer to those children as orphan children, even though the mother is still alive. So that gives you kind of a sense of how important that connection is. And so therefore a widow should devote herself, particularly to motherhood in the ideal. And so there are all of these things that widows are supposed to do. Of course, then you insert the Civil War and you have this situation where you have a number of very young widows. Not to say that women weren't widowed at a young age in the antebellum era. It absolutely happened, but not to this scale. And also in some towns, not to this concentration, right? You think about some of these battles where entire regiments are wiped out. Well, then you have almost an entire regiment of widows left behind, which is a whole interesting dynamic in itself. And so through reading all of these letters and diaries and stories, any story that I could find, you started seeing how complicated it was, right? Some women are very much willing and able to play to these ideals, and they very much want to. Some of them seem to find genuine comfort from trying to meet these customs. Some widows, even those that are very, very poor, are working to meet these customs, right? So it's not just something that's an elite phenomenon. So I found a number of people of letters, very poorly written, women who clearly did not have any formal education, who are spelling phonetically and those kinds of things, who are asking their sisters, how can I get the materials I need to dye my dresses black, right? So they're going to take the only dresses that they have and dye them so that they can express their mourning. And then also elite women writing about lower class women who are trying to do this sort of thing. But then of course you have the widows, and I'm assuming there might be some overlap with Allison's work here, who didn't seem all that heartbroken that their husbands were gone, right? There certainly were unhappy marriages. There certainly were abusive marriages. And you can see a lot of those tensions in the letters. You didn't always explicitly get a widow saying, oh, I'm so glad, right? But the depth of emotion, the amount of mourning that she does, maybe isn't there. Then of course, if you start layering in class even more, you have widows who are too busy to mourn in this way. You have also widows who are too heartbroken, right? They're not going to say God's will be done because of that emotional impact on their life. And again, may not be all that supportive of the Confederacy. And then you do have that small number of Scarlett OHaras out there who are young and beautiful and wealthy and not interested in mourning for 2.5 years, and who are out dancing and flirting and lots of disappointed relatives writing letters, lots of disappointed communities putting pressure on why are you doing this? Some of them, again, choosing to remarry very quickly. And so that also brings about some really interesting letters. You'll have a widow who's getting all of these letters, these condolence letters describing the death of her late husband, and she's already remarried. Sometimes, again, out of practical, but sometimes there's a lot more that's going on. So,
right.
Yeah.
And in those cases, when they do sort of, deviate from societal norms, that they are censured for their behavior.
Again, for the most part, yes, especially if it is an elite woman with money and a family whose reputation that's on the line. Sometimes it comes from the mother-in-law. Again, especially if there's a child who gets very, very vocal about how the widow is mourning if she doesn't think she's doing it properly, or if she's not raising the child in the way that the mother-in-law thinks that it should be raised. A lot of times the in-laws very much wanted the widow to move in with them. And from the mother-in-law, right? So she's lost her son. He might have only been in his mid-20s. That grandchild might be the only connection she has to that boy. And if they had gotten married quickly before the war, which happens, a lot of courtships could compress in that kind of wartime patriotic rush to the altar. The mother-in-law is very concerned. And so there is tension, and some of it's very slight. So it'll come through. So for example, one widow, she was pregnant at the time of her husband's death. His name was Winston. And so she named the child Winston. This was very common a lot of times to name after the husband, but she could never call her son that. She called him Winnie because it was too hard for her to call him Winston. And so she gets letter after letter from her mother-in-law. Winnie is an ugly name. Winnie is a woman's name. Call him after the man, that you named him for. And unfortunately, we don't have that widow's responses back, but you see the mother-in-law and some of this tension and kind of that pressure that's getting put on her.
Okay, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So for both of you to sort of bring it back, then I think what might be a useful segue and something to think about is either after divorce or in the midst of mourning, and you started to hint at this, Angela, but like, how do these women begin to sort of reconstruct their senses of identity? And in some instances, how do they use this newly gained political capital in a pretty new situation? And so maybe we'll turn it back down to you, Allison, first, and then we'll bounce it back to Angela, if that's fair.
Well, I would say in mine, so my women are not using as much political capital, I would say,
Okay.
but they are, what I would say I see a lot of after the Civil War is I see women kind of trying to take control over their own lives. I know that one thing I explored, I think a little bit in the article that you brought up in the Emancipation collection, is I found like 3 or 4, which isn't a lot, but was a striking number of divorce cases in Kentucky that were all bringing up women who were abandoning their husbands, and they were all using the same kind of turn of phrase, which is, I'm free now and I can do what I want. But they weren't former slaves. They were white, but they were using this idea of like, were kind of almost emancipated from their relationships. And so I found it really interesting the ways in which they kind of took the independence that they had had during the war to kind of say, sometimes they'll use the language of like, he can no longer tell me what to do. And so I see that sometimes in terms of women who are abandoning husbands or have started affairs and are kind of unrepentant about it. And they use this language to kind of say like, I'm my own woman, I can do what I want. It's not incredibly common, but it is in there in a really interesting way that, you know, I can't necessarily draw a total connection like, oh, these women are saying they're inspired by this. But I have to think that either their experiences of the Civil War in some way are influencing this, because that language is really striking.
And so maybe this would connect to a question then. I mean, so this was something that I would surmise was a surprise once you were in the archives, is that right? I mean, I think one of the most interesting things is when you start reading things in source materials that you don't expect. And, you know, just for our audience, I know some of you have advanced degrees, some of you don't, but I mean, in the grad school process, just as a sort of quick, you know, you immerse yourself in the secondary literature, you spend literally years reading other historians' works, and you think you know a lot. And then you go into the archives, and a lot of times the primary source material, I think, like surprises you despite the, you know, knowledge that you've acquired. And I think that's one of the exciting moments when you're in the archives, is that you all of a sudden realize, oh, I have a project, like I have a new perspective. And it's not that the other scholars didn't, you know, necessarily miss it, but there's just a lot of source material out there for what we do. There are literally hundreds of thousands of documents for the Civil War era, going into the millions easily. And so it can be kind of overwhelming. So when you were first encountering that type of language, was that a surprise to what you sort of knew or expected?
Yeah, I think it was. And I think in the way, you know, Angela's talking so much about social pressure that's being put on people. I think it was really, I think I thought these women would be more, I don't think ashamed is the right word, but they would be more like, they would want to bend to this kind of social pressure. Because, you know, even though I am obviously studying these places that have more divorces than places like Virginia and the Deep South, they're not a lot. I mean, these women are still outliers there, but that they're willing sometimes. Not all of these women said these things in court, but I'm often amazed at how many women will even go into a courtroom and say things or write a letter to the court, and they are not hiding anything. I tell that to my students a lot when I show them the documents, is that one of the things that surprises me the most when I read divorce cases was how, like, I thought there would be more of a sense of privacy, I think, too. And like, it's all there. Like, you find out things that you never thought you would find out about people's lives in the 19th century.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Yeah. And I don't know, like sometimes I think that creates a tension in me as I'm reading, you know, these really intimate details about people's lives that just, I don't know, like I said, sometimes it bothers me, I guess.
No,
But
I have this one couple, you know, and at the bottom, she's writing about her pregnancy, and she's writing pretty candidly about how she hopes she sees him soon, or she's going to be too big and he won't be able to get his arms around her and all of this. And then at the bottom, burn this letter, circle, circle, circle. And I think, oh dear, you know, I mean, right. So how do you reconcile that this is such an important voice that didn't want to end up in an archive, and certainly didn't want me reading it 150 years later. So.
Yeah,
I think that's a good point.
Yeah, it is. And going back to the broader question, Angela, I think, you know, you do engage in your scholarship this interesting point that women are using a newly acquired political capital. Is that fair? And,
yeah,
and if so, what are we doing?
Yeah, in all sorts of different ways. I'll just give one example. So I was really profoundly impacted by Stephanie McCurry's work, and kind of started building on that critical foundation that she has about women who are writing to governors, who are writing to local and state officials, women who probably would never show up in any other way. They certainly, you know, haven't found letters, diaries, or any of those kinds of things, but women who, in my situation, they lost their husband to the Confederacy. They feel like the Confederacy owes them something, whether that is food, whether that is financial support, maybe a connection of some sort from one of their children. And so you start seeing all of these letters, again, some of them very poorly written, some of them that seem to be written by someone else, and then this widow has signed her name to. So that for me, I think, is an example that widows themselves did recognize, at least some of them, that they had a special connection. And they will say it, you know, my husband didn't die so that I would be destitute or so that I wouldn't be able to put food on the table. Therefore, basically, you owe me something. How can you help me? It is your responsibility to step into this role that my husband has vacated fighting for your cause.
Yeah, and again, for our audience, Stephanie McCurry's Confederate Reckoning, profoundly influential book. I don't know if it's within arm's reach, but one of the things that she highlights so well in it is she has these middle chapters that focus in on semi-literate, probably sometimes illiterate, yeoman farmers' wives, yeoman farmer women, who actively petition, especially Joe Brown in Georgia and Zebulon Vance in North Carolina. Really strong language, this idea, as Angela highlighted, that the state now owes them. Their identity as soldiers' wives has invested them in the Confederate project. And in turn, because they have suffered this loss through that war, the state in turn must fulfill this promise by giving their men to the cause now must help them. And one of our viewers rightfully notes, of course, the overt protests. I don't want to use the word riots, but they did call them the bread riots that break out from Richmond all the way down to North Carolina, down into Augusta and beyond. And those are the kind of the most famous vocal moments in which women are deeply politicized. But I think what's so interesting about McCurry's work is that she certainly highlights that, but then she also just finds all of these petitions that scholars really had largely missed. And it puts women in an entirely different light. We have an entirely different understanding of how deeply political they were and how the nature of obligations between the citizen and the state are shifting. So I think it's a really powerful work. To sort of bring it back home here as we're coming up on our hour. Like I said, it goes quick. Maybe we won't do the screen shares today. I want to talk a bit about legacy and memory. And so for both of you, maybe you could speak kind of broadly about women's history, why you've chosen to sort of pursue the type of scholarship that you have, and then more specifically, illuminate for our audience how they should understand the Civil War era through the experiences of the historical actors that you look at. If that's not too much. So we'll turn back down to Allison, who looks chagrined and unhappy with me right now.
I think for me, I guess why I got involved in women's history is that it's like I wanted to learn about a history that I had a deeper connection with than a history I had often learned about growing up. And I think that's still my entry point is I'm not a politician. I am not a lawmaker. I am not a soldier. And so I think that I have always just been really interested in, and I think it's interesting listening to Angela's history because I feel like it's similar. I'm interested in how just people work as people, like what their daily lives are like, what's actually happening inside their homes in these small little minor everyday relationships. And so I think that those were the sorts of questions and those are the sorts of things I wanted to learn about. And that was kind of what got me interested in the first place. And I think when I think about the Civil War, I do think it is this profoundly influential thing, but I think so often we focus on that from this kind of high up perspective instead of, it's whatever I may say in some of my articles, and like you mentioned the emancipation article, and I talk about the ways in which it's not necessarily emancipation as much of a shift in the households, in some of these households I'm looking at, it's still a profound period. The Civil War is incredibly disruptive, and it's disruptive in homes. And so I think that I was just searching for a personal history, and that is what I think for me, when you look at women's history and you look at this Civil War, it's about thinking about these moments that we often think are so big and meta, but just how everyday people live through them. Thinking about ourselves right now in this pandemic, like, right? When we look at this history, are the people who are studying it going to be thinking about how I was sitting here on the floor while my kids were out taking a bath? You know, like, are they going to know this little moment that I was having? Or are they just going to know what is happening in Congress today? So I really think in a lot of ways, thinking about how I structured like my workday and balanced it with my husband today in a way that maybe we never wrote down and we never talked about, but that is the interesting history that I want to know.
That's fair.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I fell into my project, some of you may know Dr. John Insco. As a first-year master's student, I was sitting in one of his seminar classes, and he said, you know, we've got to write this research paper on communities. And I had no idea, no idea what I was going to do. And so I did what many graduate students do. I marched down to the archives at the University of Georgia, and I sat down and I said, you know, just start bringing me boxes, family letters, correspondence, trying to find something that sparked. And I found this collection of Rosa Deloney and her husband. And I'm reading these letters, you know, of them before the war. And I realized that, you know, where they had gotten married, I just walked past that street in Athens, and that was really powerful for me. And that they had these young children, and then he leaves to fight for the Confederacy. And so I'm reading these love letters they're penning during the war about love and loss and fighting and their hopes and their dreams and all of this. And she's pregnant at the time. And then all of a sudden I'm holding this telegraph that is the telegraph that lets her know her husband has been killed. And that was profoundly powerful to me. I still can't get over the fact that we're actually allowed to hold these documents in archives, like the literal letters, the handwriting, the bits of paper that made up this person's life, and in this case, changed her life forever. And then I was struck by the fact that there was so much more in the box, and that I could continue to read on about her life and her quest to try to get her husband's body home, because she wanted him buried in Athens. So she had a place to mourn him and visit him and tell his children about him. And she's finally successful a couple years after the war. But the sad twist is that her daughter, who she gave birth to, the daughter that her husband never knew, died of whooping cough a couple months before she brought the body home. And so if you go to the cemetery in Athens today, you see, you know, this 3-year-old's grave next to her father's grave. And yet I know there's this whole other story. And that was it for me. That was the spark. And that's how I started going down this morbid trail of looking for death and love and loss, and in some cases no love and loss, and figuring out how that affected people, but then seeing how it affected the politics. I think the line I've heard so many times is the personal is political. And, you know, sometimes that's in very overt ways, and a widow who is writing to the government, to her local officials saying, you owe me something. And sometimes it's not, sometimes it's so subtle. But I think that's just as valuable.
Yeah, I think those are lovely sentiments. And you know, I think I agree that it's often the personal stories that sort of force us to keep going through these monumental archival collections, but those stories can be just so incredibly compelling and powerful. And I think what makes both of your works so good is that I think you do have a certain almost empathy for the historical actors, still contextualize them, understanding, of course, that there's a lot of problems associated with the people that we study, but nonetheless, the source materials themselves have spoken to us in ways that we want to communicate to our readers. And so with that, I think we'll end on that was a nice note. So I think you all summarized things very lovely. So for our audience this evening, thank you very much for tuning in. As always, we deeply appreciate your time. We hope everyone is staying healthy, safe and well. And so with that, we'll close off and say thank you. Okay. So
thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Have a lovely evening. And I'm going to close it.